The night was blacker than ink, the horizon swallowed by a restless sea. Only the bursts of gunfire and the sporadic flash of explosions illuminated the Pacific waters. The USS Collister rocked under the strain of the battle, its metal hull groaning like a wounded animal as shells struck the nearby waters. Men shouted orders, their voices muffled by the roar of engines and the scream of sirens that wailed in the background. Lieutenant Sarah Cole crouched low on the deck, her hands already smeared with blood. The young sailor beneath her whimpered, a deep gash splitting across his thigh. She pressed gauze against it, ignoring the sting of seawater mixed with sweat dripping into her eyes. "Stay with me, Lopez," she said firmly, her voice carrying a calm authority that belied the chaos. "You're going to make it. Do you hear? Me? Breathe. Just breathe." The boy, he couldn't have been older than 19, nodded weakly. His face was pale, eyes wide with terror. Sarah wrapped the wound tight, tightening the tourniquet until he groaned. Then, without hesitation, she lifted him, dragging his limp weight across the slick deck toward cover. Around her, sailors scrambled to man the guns, the thunder of artillery, rattling every bone in her body. The night reeked of smoke and burning fuel. Metal clanged, boots hammered against steel, and above it all the shrill cries of the injured pierced the dark. Sarah had long ago trained herself to block out the panic, to narrow her focus to one thing only: survival, hers and theirs. She wasn't just a medic. She was their lifeline dot as she hauled Lopez toward the infirmary hatch. A sudden explosion ripped through the air. The deck pitched violently, throwing her and her patient against the cold metal. Sparks showered down from ruptured wiring overhead. Sarah shielded Lopez with her body, gritting her teeth as heat seared her back. "Medic!" Another voice shouted through the haze. "Over here!" Sarah's head snapped toward the cry. Two more sailors lay sprawled near a shattered railing. One unconscious, the other clutching his chest and gasping for air. Without hesitation, Sarah dragged Lopez the last few feet to safety, shouting for another corpsman to take over. Then she sprinted back into the open, weaving between bursts of machine gun fire and shards of flying debris. She dropped to her knees beside the men. One's eyes rolled back, his lips blue. She ripped open his shirt, pressing her ear to his. Chest, no heartbeat. No air. "Damn it," she hissed, already pressing her palms against his sternum. She began compressions, counting under her breath, ignoring the ache in her shoulders. 1, 2, 3, 4. The other sailor cried out, blood bubbling between his fingers as he tried to breathe. Her mind raced save one, stabilize the other. That was the equation of war. Impossible choices, split-second decisions. She refused to let either go. As she pumped the man's chest, she shouted orders to a nearby deckhand. "Hold his wound. Press down hard. Don't let go, no matter what." The boy obeyed, hands trembling as he pressed on his comrade's chest wound. Sarah leaned over the lifeless sailor, forcing air into his lungs, and returned to compressions. Sweat trickled down her temple, streaking through soot and grime. Her arms screamed in protest, but she didn't stop. Finally, after what felt like eternity, a faint cough rattled in his throat. He gasped, eyes fluttering open. Relief surged through her veins like electricity. "That's it," she whispered fiercely, tears stinging her eyes, though she didn't stop working. "That's it. Come back to me. You're not done yet." She motioned to another medic rushing by. "Get them both to the infirmary now." The men were lifted onto stretchers. Sarah rose unsteadily, her knees buckling, but she didn't allow herself a second of rest. More cries filled the air. The battle raged on. Her work wasn't finished. She sprinted across the deck, her boots slipping on blood and seawater. In the distance, Enemy fire streaked the sky, fiery arcs raining destruction on the Collister. The ship groaned under the punishment, but the crew fought on with unyielding grit. Sarah spotted another wounded man slumped near a gun mount. As she rushed toward him, a piercing whistle cut through the chaos, the telltale sound of incoming artillery. Down! Someone screamed. She dove instinctively, throwing herself over the sailor just as the shell struck the deck. The blast thundered in her ears, the shockwave lifting her off the ground and slamming her against the railing. Metal screamed as shards exploded outward like knives. One jagged fragment tore into her side, hot and merciless, embedding itself between her ribs. Pain was instant and blinding. Her breath caught, eyes wide with shock. She pressed a hand to her side, feeling the warm gush of blood soak her uniform. For a heartbeat, the world tilted, her vision narrowing to a tunnel. But the sailor beneath her stirred, groaning in pain. And just like that, Sarah forced herself upright. Gritting her teeth, she ignored the searing agony. Her own life could wait. His could not. She pulled him into a sitting position, quickly assessing the damage. His leg was nearly shattered, blood pulsing from a severed artery. She tore strips from her already ruined uniform, binding the wound with trembling but steady hands. Each movement sent a wave of fire through her ribs, but she didn't falter. "You're going to live," she promised, voice hoarse. "Not on my watch. Do you understand?" The sailor tried to speak, but she silenced him. "Save your strength." The deck trembled under another barrage. Shouts echoed, and smoke thickened until it stung her lungs. She could feel the blood soaking deeper into her side, the warmth of it frighteningly constant. But she refused to let the darkness win. She had endured worse before. When the sailor was stabilized, she dragged him toward the hatch, every step tearing fire through her body. Her knees wobbled, her vision blurred, but her grip never loosened. She could feel the slick trail of her own blood marking their path. But she didn't slow. At last, another corpsman appeared, eyes widening as he saw her condition. "Lieutenant, take him," she barked, thrusting the sailor into his arms. Her voice was steel despite her pale face. "Get him to the infirmary, now." The corpsman obeyed, but not without a worried glance back at her. Sarah leaned heavily against the bulkhead, one hand clamped to her side. She could feel the world spinning, hear the distant echo of alarms, but she straightened. There were more wounded. She could not stop. Her heart pounded, sweat dripping into her eyes. Every breath was sharp, every movement the battle. Yet deep inside, a voice whispered fiercely, "Not yet. Not here. Not like this." The war roared around her, unforgiving and merciless. But Sarah Cole, bleeding and broken, kept moving forward, because saving others was the only thing that mattered. And somewhere deep within, beneath the pain and the chaos, she knew this wound would not be the last scar she carried, but it would never be the one to end her. The corridors of the USS Collister groaned with the weight of battle. Red emergency lights pulsed along the walls, casting long shadows over the sailors carrying their wounded comrades. The smell of oil and smoke clung to everything, mingling with the copper tongue of blood. Lieutenant Sarah Cole was among them, half dragged and half walking as two corpsmen supported her on the arms. Her uniform was soaked through at the ribs, the dark stains spreading with each step. Her boots scuffed against the deck as she stumbled forward, refusing to allow herself to be carried completely. Every fiber of her being resisted surrender. The infirmary doors hissed open with a metallic groan, revealing a space already overflowing with the injured. The once sterile room was chaos. Now stretcher after stretcher lined the walls, medics darting between patients, voices raised in clipped orders. The air was thick with antiseptic and iron. "Lieutenant Cole, incoming critical." A medic shouted as they eased her onto a gurney. Sarah tried to wave them off. "There are others worse." "Not another word," the senior corpsman snapped, pressing a gloved hand against the wound at her side. Blood seeped between his fingers. "If we don't get you stabilized now, you won't last an hour." She bit her lip until she tasted blood of her own. He was right, but she loathed the helplessness of lying down while others cried out for help around her. She strained to sit up, but the corpsman forced her back. The infirmary doors slid open again. This time, the atmosphere shifted. The chatter dropped, movement slowed. Boots clicked steadily against the floor, polished and precise. Admiral James. Harrington had entered. He was a man known for his iron discipline, tall with a posture as straight as the mast of a ship. His presence carried weight, heavier than any rank pinned to his uniform. Lines etched his weathered face, carved by decades at sea and countless battles survived. His eyes, cold steel blue, swept across the chaos before settling on Sarah's. Gurney. Medics stiffened instinctively, standing straighter, working faster. Harrington's reputation was one of respect and fear. He rarely set foot in the infirmary, preferring to command from the bridge. His arrival here was unusual, and everyone knew it. Sarah felt his gaze before she saw him, a pressure that prickled across her skin. When he stopped beside her gurney, she forced herself to meet his eyes, despite the haze of pain clouding her vision. "Lieutenant Cole," Harrington said, his voice low but carrying. "They tell me you pulled 3 men out under fire." Her throat was dry, but she managed. "2 alive, sir." "1. Barely." His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He glanced at the corpsman pressing against her wound, then back at Sarah. "And yet you kept moving." She tried to shrug, the motion sending a spike of pain through her ribs. "Doing my job, Admiral." The corpsman began cutting away her blood-soaked uniform, but she pushed his hands aside, clutching the fabric to her chest. Panic flickered in her eyes, not from the wound, but from the exposure. "Wait," she rasped, Harrington's brows furrowed. "Lieutenant, this is not the time for modesty. Show them the injury." Her breath quickened. She pressed the torn fabric tighter against her ribs, shaking her head. "It's nothing, I can." "Enough." Harrington's voice cut like a blade. The medics froze, caught between duty and hesitation. His eyes locked on hers, hard and unyielding. "If you want to survive, you will let them treat you. Do you understand me?" The silence between them stretched. Sweat trickled down Sarah's temple, her pulse hammering in her ears. She wanted to argue, to deflect, but the weight of his stare held her in place. Her hands trembled. Slowly, with visible reluctance, she loosened her grip on the shredded fabric. She lifted the edge of her shirt, just enough for the medics to see. The wound was bad, jagged metal embedded deep, blood pooling around the torn flesh. But it wasn't the fresh injury that drew the Admiral's attention. As the light hit her skin, a series of pale, faded scars revealed themselves, crisscrossing her ribs like ghosts of old battles. They were long-healed, but unmistakable. The medics faltered for a beat, exchanging glances. Harrington's expression, usually carved in stone, shifted ever so slightly. His mouth tightened, his eyes darkened. He had expected wounds of war. These were not that. He said nothing. The silence was heavy, almost suffocating. Sarah's face burned under their stares, though her body was cold with shock. She clenched her jaw, forcing herself to hold still as the medics bent to their work. Every stitch of their needles bit deep, every press of gauze sent fire through her nerves, but none of it hurt as much as the Admiral's silence. She wanted him to speak, to look away, to do anything but stand there with that expression part recognition, part sorrow, part something she couldn't name. At last, the senior corpsman muttered, "She'll need surgery to remove the shrapnel. Prep her for transfer." Harrington gave a sharp nod, but his eyes never left Sarah's scars. He lingered a heartbeat longer, then turned abruptly and strode out, his boots striking the deck like thunder. Only when the doors closed behind him did Sarah release the breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Her hands trembled as she lowered her shirt again, covering the scars. She turned her face away, blinking back tears she refused to shed. The medics continued their work in silence, and though they said nothing, she could feel their unspoken questions filling the air. Sarah Cole had faced explosions, bullets, and fire without flinching. But tonight, in that infirmary, it wasn't the shrapnel in her side that had left her feeling exposed. It was the scars of a war she had fought long before ever donning a uniform. The infirmary was alive with frantic movement, metal trays rattling, voices overlapping, the hiss of oxygen tanks punctuating every order. Yet around Sarah Cole's gurney, time seemed to slow. She had lifted her shirt high enough to expose the jagged shrapnel wound tearing into her ribs. Blood welled fresh, sticky, and hot against the antiseptic air. But it wasn't the gaping injury. That had silenced the room. It was the scars. They lay there, etched into her flesh like cruel handwriting from another life. Pale and raised, some long and thin, others short and clustered, they crisscrossed her rib cage in unnatural patterns. No medic worth his salt would mistake them for shrapnel or battlefield debris. They weren't random, they were deliberate. For a heartbeat, nobody spoke. The corpsman holding the sutures hesitated mid-movement, his eyes darting between her side, and the Admiral standing like a statue at the foot of the gurney. Admiral James Harrington's expression was carved in stone, but something in his eyes betrayed him. A flick of rage, sorrow, recognition, Sarah couldn't tell. He had commanded fleets, buried men, and watched ships sink beneath waves. But these scars, these were not the work of war. Sarah's throat burned. She clenched her teeth, forcing herself to stay still under their stares. The silence pressed against her chest, harder than any bandage. She could have endured the pain of the needle, the fire of antiseptic, the shrapnel tearing into her ribs, but not this. Focus on the wound, she snapped hoarsely, her voice sharp with embarrassment. The medics jolted back into action. One pressed fresh gauze against the bleeding wound. Another prepared the surgical kit. The rhythm of work returned, though the air remained heavy. Sarah kept her gaze fixed on the ceiling, refusing to look at the Admiral. The fluorescent lights hummed, blurry in her vision. Each flicker seemed to pulse with memory. She saw shadows. From another time, another place, shadows shaped like fists, belts, the cruel glint of bottles shattering against walls. She blinked rapidly, trying to force the images away. But the scars were there, telling the story she had fought for years to bury. And now they were out in the open, stripped bare under the harsh light of the infirmary. Harrington's silence was worse than words. He had said nothing since she revealed them. No comment, no question, not even the usual clipped order he gave. In every other circumstance, he stood rooted to the spot, his hands clasped behind his back, his jaw clenched tight. His eyes remained fixed on her, but they weren't cold military eyes anymore. They carried weight, an unbearable weight. The medics moved quickly. The senior corpsman leaned over her. "Ma'am, we'll need to extract the fragment. Stay with me. This will hurt." Sarah swallowed, her throat dry as sand. "Do it." The needle pierced her skin, stitching arteries closed, preparing the wound for removal. Each tug sent white-hot agony through her side. She refused to cry out. Her lips pressed into a hard line, her fists curling against the sheets. In the corner of her vision, she saw Harrington's shoulders stiffen at every sound she didn't make. He looked as though he wanted to speak, but words failed him. "Almost there," the corpsman muttered. "Hold steady." Sarah focused on her breathing. One inhale, one exhale. In through the nose, out through the mouth. A trick she had learned. Long ago, not on the battlefield, but in a dingy room where silence meant safety. She had trained herself not to scream, not to react, not to give power to those who wanted to break her. The Navy had given her a new battlefield, but the scars of that first war never left. When the shard of metal was finally lifted free with a sickening clink, she exhaled sharply, her body sagging into the gurney. Blood was wiped, the wound sealed, the bandages wrapped tight. The medics worked in efficient silence, as though unwilling to intrude on the tension hanging between their patient and their commander. At last, the corpsman stepped back. "She's stable, Admiral. The worst is over for now. She need rest and monitoring." Harrington gave a curt nod, but his gaze never wavered from Sarah. "Dismissed," he said. His voice was steady, but quieter than usual. The medics exchanged uneasy glances, then moved away to tend to other patients. The infirmary noise swelled again, moans, clattering instruments, hurried footsteps. But around Sarah and the Admiral, a bubble of silence remained. She shifted slightly, tugging the edge of the blanket up to cover her ribs again. Her hands trembled despite her effort to keep them steady. Finally, she forced herself to look at him. Her eyes met his, defiant even through exhaustion. "You've seen enough, Admiral. Don't make it something it's not." His jaw tightened. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, quietly, he replied, "I make nothing of it, Lieutenant. The scars speak for themselves." Her heart thudded painfully. She wanted to lash out, to demand he keep his thoughts to himself, but she couldn't find the strength. Instead, she turned her face back to the ceiling, closing her eyes. "Then do me a favor, sir. Forget them." Harrington didn't move. His silence lingered for several heartbeats more. Then his boots clicked sharply against the deck as he turned. Without another word, he left the infirmary. Sarah opened her eyes, staring into the humming lights above. The sounds of the infirmary swirled around her, but she felt alone, exposed in a way no battlefield had ever made her feel. The wound would heal. The scars had already healed. But the Admiral's silence, it cut deeper than either. She pulled the blanket tighter, curling slightly to one side, her breath uneven. Memories whispered at the edges of her mind, voices from long ago she had sworn never to hear again. She clenched her fists, forcing herself to shut them out. No, she wasn't that girl anymore. She was Lieutenant Sarah Cole, U.S. Navy. She saved lives. She fought wars. She had built herself into someone stronger than the scars. And yet tonight, under the Admiral's steady gaze, all of that strength had felt fragile. She closed her eyes again, willing herself to sleep. Tomorrow would bring new battles, new wounds, new duties. But she knew the Admiral had seen her truth now. And no matter how much she wished otherwise, she couldn't undo that moment of revelation. The infirmary had quieted after the Admiral's departure. The hum of machines and the low murmurs of medics filled the air, but the sharp focus of attention on Sarah had faded. She lay beneath the thin blanket, her body aching, her ribs wrapped tightly in fresh bandages. Though the bleeding had stopped, her mind would not. She turned her face to the side, staring at the metal wall, its surface dented by years of service. The shadows cast by the red emergency lights flickered across it, dancing like ghosts. Her body was exhausted, yet sleep would not come. Not with. The Admiral's eyes burned into her memory. Not with the silence he left behind. The scars were no longer just hers. Someone else had seen them, someone who mattered, someone who couldn't look at them and mistake them for anything else. And with that realization, the past she had buried clawed back to the surface. She was 12 the first time she realized. Her ribs could break like fragile twigs. The belt had come down across her side, sharp and merciless. The sound of leather snapping against skin still echoed in her mind, accompanied by the roar of her father's voice. He had been drunk, though. That was no excuse. He was always drunk, always angry, always looking for someone to bleed the poison of his life into. Sarah had learned quickly that crying only made it worse. Crying was weakness, and weakness drew his rage like blood in the water. So she bit her lip, pressed her face into the pillow, and endured. By the time she was 15, the scars were a map of her survival. She counted them in secret at night, fingers tracing the ridges when no one else could see. She told herself each mark was proof she had lived, proof that his hands had failed to end her. She remembered one night in particular, rain hammering against the broken roof, her mother sitting in silence at the kitchen table, cigarette smoke curling in the dim light. Sarah had stumbled down the stairs, her shirt sticking to blood. Her ribs. Her mother hadn't looked up, hadn't moved, hadn't spoken. That silence had cut deeper than the blows. A voice in the present cut through the memory. "Lieutenant?" Sarah blinked, pulled back into the infirmary. A young nurse was standing beside her bed, adjusting her fore. The girl looked barely out of training, her hands careful but unsure. "You should try to rest," the nurse said softly. "Your vitals need it." Sarah nodded once, forcing composure into her features. "Thank you." When the nurse walked away, Sarah exhaled slowly, staring at the ceiling again. Rest. They always said rest. As if rest could erase the fire seared into memory, as if it could wipe away the voices, the belt, the silence. She turned onto her side, wincing as the bandages pulled tight. She closed her eyes, and the memories came again. At 16, she had run. The night had been thick with summer heat, cicadas screaming in the dark. Her ribs ached from another beating, the newest scar burning fresh under her shirt. She had stuffed her few belongings into a backpack and slipped out the back door while her father lay unconscious in his chair. She remembered the rush of fear, the taste of freedom sharp on her tongue. She remembered the way her heart pounded as she boarded a bus with stolen bills from his wallet. She didn't know where she was going, only that it had to be away. By 17, she had found recruiters at a Navy office. She had stood there, thin and hard-eyed, scars hidden under her clothing. When they asked why she wanted to join, she had said one word: escape. The officer had raised a brow but stamped her papers. For the first time, she felt the promise of belonging somewhere that didn't hurt. The Navy had become her salvation. Discipline was not cruelty. Orders were not abuse. The pain of training was different. It was chosen. It was earned. It was shared. Every push-up, every blister, every long night on watch had been freedom compared to the chains of home. But the scars had remained, silent reminders beneath the uniform. Secrets no one ever saw. Now, in the sterile light of the infirmary, she realized the truth she hated most. Those scars had been seen, not just by anyone, but by Admiral Harrington, a man who had built his life on strength and silence, just like her. A man whose opinion mattered, and the look in his eyes, that weight of recognition, it was unbearable. She pulled the blanket tighter around herself, curling against the ache in her ribs. Her throat tightened as if she were 12 again, fighting to keep from crying out. She had sworn long ago never to let anyone see her weakness. But the Admiral's silence had pierced her armor in a way no bullet ever had. For a moment, she considered what it would be like if she had told him the truth. If she had spoken of the nights she bled quietly into her sheets, of the mornings she went to school pretending she had fallen downstairs. If she had told him that the Navy hadn't just been a career, but the only thing that kept her alive. But she couldn't. Words would turn those scars into pity, and pity was the one. things she refused to accept. So she kept her silence, just as he had kept his. Somewhere across the room, another sailor cried out in pain, and the medics rushed to his side. Sarah closed her eyes, listening to the chaos around her, forcing herself to breathe slowly. She thought of the Admiral again, of the way he had stood frozen, his jaw tight, his eyes locked on hers. He had said nothing, but in that silence, she had heard everything. He knew. He understood. And though she hated the exposure, some small part of her found comfort in it. For once, she was not invisible. For once, someone had seen the war she had fought before this one. Her chest ached, not from the wound, but from the weight of memory. She pressed her hand against the blanket, feeling the bandages beneath. The scars were there, hidden again, but they would never truly disappear. She would carry them forever, not as shame, not as weakness, but as proof that she had survived. Sarah Cole closed her eyes at last, exhaustion dragging her into uneasy sleep. The hum of the infirmary faded, and the ghosts of her past retreated into the corners of her mind. But she knew they would return. They always did. And when they did, she would face them the way she faced everything else head-on, silent and unbroken. Admiral James Harrington walked the corridors of the USS, Collister with his usual precision, but tonight his stride lacked its familiar steel. The ship around him hummed with the restless sounds of damage control welding torches sparking, sailors shouting orders, bulkheads creaking under strain. Yet his mind was not on the ship, nor the battle that had battered it. His thoughts were still in the infirmary. Sarah Cole's face lingered in his memory, pale and defiant even as she bled. But more than that, it was her scars. He had expected to see the torn flesh of shrapnel, the kind of wound he had witnessed countless times over his decades of service. He had prepared himself for the usual blood, the grit, the raw endurance soldiers showed under fire. But when her shirt lifted, the truth had been laid bare, scars that spoke of something far older, far more insidious than any battlefield. Harrington had seen cruelty in many forms. He had seen men shot down, ships swallowed by the sea, children orphaned by war. But the scars on Sarah's ribs were not made by the chaos of battle. They were deliberate, controlled, the marks of a personal war fought in silence. And for the first time in years, he had been struck speechless. He found himself alone now, in his private quarters. The hum of the ship's engines vibrated faintly through the floor, a constant reminder of the steel giant he commanded. He sat at his desk, hands folded, staring at the dark wood surface without seeing it. He hated silence. It was dangerous. Silence allowed the past to creep in. His own memories were etched into him just as deeply as the lines on his face. Harrington had joined the Navy at 17, escaping a childhood not unlike the one Sarah's scars hinted at. His father had been a miner, hard, bitter, with fists like hammers and a temper like wildfire. Harrington had learned early how to stay quiet, how to keep his head down, how to fight back when he grew strong enough. But unlike Sarah, no one had ever seen his scars. His were hidden deeper, carved into his mind rather than his skin. He had spent a lifetime burying them under discipline, order, and command. He had risen through the ranks not because he was fearless, but because he refused to be broken. And tonight, seeing those scars on her body had felt like a mirror held too close. He rose abruptly, pacing the room. His boots struck the floor with sharp cracks. He needed clarity, but clarity eluded him. He could handle a failing engine, a sinking ship, even a mutiny. But how did a man command his silence when the truth was written across someone else's flesh? His silence in the infirmary haunted him. He had wanted to speak, to tell her she wasn't alone, that he understood, more than she could imagine. But the words had stuck in his throat. An admiral did not expose his soul to a subordinate. Command demanded distance. Distance was strength. And yet, he saw again the way Sarah had covered herself after the medics finished, pulling the blanket tight, her hands trembling despite her iron will. He had recognized that shame. He had lived it. And his silence, though meant to be respectful, had felt like a failure. There was a knock at the door. "Enter," Harrington barked, his voice sharper than intended. Commander Lewis stepped in. A man of equal years, but lesser burdens. He saluted quickly. "Damage reports from engineering, sir. The fires are contained. Hull integrity at 70%. We can hold." Harrington nodded, scanning the papers without truly reading them. "Very well. Dismissed." Lewis hesitated. "Sir, word is you visited the infirmary. Lieutenant Cole," Harrington's gaze snapped up, "is stable." His tone brooked. No further discussion. Lewis nodded quickly and left. The door hissed shut again, leaving Harrington alone with the hum of the engines and the ghosts in his head. He sat back down, rubbing a hand over his face. He wasn't a man given to self-doubt, but tonight unease gnawed at him. Sarah Cole was young, barely 30. A medic who had saved lives under fire without hesitation. She had proven herself more than once. Yet beneath the uniform she carried wounds no one else had seen until tonight. He wondered how many others under his command carried similar battles. How many smiles and salutes hid bruises from another life. He had spent decades commanding ships, demanding excellence, expecting obedience. But had he ever looked closely enough to see the humanity beneath the uniforms? He hated himself for the answer. Hours passed. The ship settled into an uneasy calm, its crew exhausted but alive. Harrington remained in his quarters, his thoughts circling like restless sharks. Finally, he rose and poured himself a measure of whiskey from the cabinet. The amber liquid glowed in the dim light as he swirled it in the glass. He had long ago given up drinking to forget. It never worked. But tonight, he needed something to cut through the silence. He thought of Sarah again, of the way she had refused pity, the way she had snapped at the medics to focus on the wound, not the scars. That defiance was strength. She didn't want his sympathy. She wanted his respect, and she had it. Harrington set the glass down untouched. Respect was not given lightly in his world, but she had earned it with blood, courage, and silence that spoke louder than words. Still, he couldn't shake the image of her lying on that gurney, scars bared, eyes burning with shame. He wanted to tell her she had nothing to be ashamed of. He wanted to tell her she was not defined by what had been done to her, but by what she had chosen to become. But he hadn't. He had stood silent, the great Admiral James Harrington, and let the moment pass. A voice from his past echoed in his ears, his old commanding officer, years ago on another ship. "Men don't talk about their pain, Harrington. They endure it. That's what makes them strong." He had believed that once. He had built his entire career on it. But tonight, looking at Sarah Cole, he questioned whether silence was strength, or simply another form of prison. He rose again, his decision made. Tomorrow, he would return to the infirmary. He wouldn't press her, wouldn't demand confessions. But he would not stay silent again. She deserved more than his wordless stare. For now, though, he allowed himself to sit in the dim glow of the lamp, a ship's hum steady beneath him. He thought of the young medic who had carried men through fire while bleeding herself. He thought of the scars she carried and the silence they demanded. And for the first time in years, Admiral Harrington whispered aloud into the empty room, "You're stronger than any of us, Cole." The words hung in the air, unburdening something in him, though no one else heard. Then he straightened, as he always did, and prepared himself for the battles still to come. Asterisk, the infirmary smelled faintly of antiseptic and iron, the kind of sharp, clinical air that never quite disguised the weight of human suffering. Admiral James Harrington hesitated at the doorway, his broad shoulders nearly filling the frame. He rarely hesitated anywhere. Yet now, his boots remained rooted, his eyes fixed on the rows of bunks before him. Sarah Cole lay in the far corner. Half hidden by the privacy curtain the nurses had drawn around her bed. She was sitting up now, propped against thin pillows, her dark hair tied back, her face pale but sharp with defiance. Even from this distance, he could see the tension in her posture. She was the kind of soldier who refused to look fragile, even when fragility was all her body could offer. Harrington exhaled once, then stepped inside. Heads turned. Sailors and medics paused in their work, surprised to see the Admiral in a place like this twice in 24 hours. Harrington acknowledged them with a curt nod, but his gaze never left Sarah. She noticed him instantly. Her eyes narrowed, her chin lifting as though bracing for a blow that would never come. He understood that look. It was the mask of someone who had learned long ago to expect judgment. He stopped at her bedside, his towering frame casting a long shadow across the sheets. For a moment, neither spoke. The silence stretched taut, filled only by the rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor at her side. "Admiral," she said finally, her voice low but steady. "Lieutenant," Harrington returned, his tone even. The curtain of formality hung heavy between them. Harrington had built his life on discipline, and Cole had built hers on survival. Neither was eager to step beyond those walls. "You should be resting," he said at last. "I've been told that more times today than I can count," she replied, a trace of dry humor sharpening her tone. "Rest isn't exactly my strong suit." Harrington's mouth twitched in something dangerously close to a smile. "So I've observed." Her eyes flicked to him, wary but curious. "Why are you here, sir?" Twice, in fact. The question was direct, and Harrington respected that. He had no patience for games. Still, the answer was not easy. "I came because—" He paused, searching for words he hadn't spoken aloud in years. "Because silence can wound as much as words." Her brow furrowed slightly. "Silence? In the infirmary yesterday?" he clarified. "When I saw—" He hesitated again, the weight of the moment pressing against his chest. "When I saw the scars, I said nothing. I should have." The air between them shifted. Sarah's hand tightened on the blanket, knuckles pale. "Don't owe me anything, Admiral," she said flatly. "Perhaps not," Harrington admitted, "but respect demands acknowledgement. And you deserve respect, more than most." For the first time since he had entered, her mask cracked. She blinked, her breath catching faintly before she turned her gaze away. "You think respect changes what those scars mean?" she asked quietly, her voice edged with bitterness. "No," Harrington said firmly, "but it changes what you make of them. Scars are not shame, Lieutenant. They are survival. Proof that you endured." Her head snapped back toward him, eyes sharp, spoken like someone who's never had to live with them, staring back at you in the mirror. Harrington held her gaze, unflinching. On the contrary, something in his tone made her pause. The Admiral rarely spoke of himself. He was a fortress of a man, built of steel and silence. Yet now, his voice carried a weight she recognized, not pity, not lecture, but lived truth. "You've seen your share," she said slowly. "I have." His eyes hardened, not with pride, but with memory. "Not carved on the skin. But scars are not always visible." Her breath caught again, softer. This time, the words hit her in a place she didn't want to admit existed. She looked away, focusing on the steady drip of the four, her chest rising and falling with controlled breaths. "So why tell me this?" she asked. "Why break the silence now?" "Because I recognize what I saw," Harrington answered simply. "And because you deserve to know you are not alone in it." The room seemed smaller now, the distance between Admiral and Lieutenant shrinking into something more human. Sarah's defenses wavered, though not entirely. She had lived too long behind walls to let them crumble easily. "You know what those scars say about me, sir?" she asked bitterly. "They say I was weak once. Too weak to fight back. Too weak to stop it." "No," Harrington said sharply, his voice cutting through the infirmary air like a blade. A few heads turned at the force in his tone, but he didn't care. "They say you survived," he continued, lowering his voice, but not his conviction. "They say that whatever tried to break you failed. Weakness doesn't leave scars, Lieutenant. Strength does." Her throat tightened, and she looked away again, blinking hard. She hated the way his words sank past her armor. Hated that they made something inside her ache with a strange foreign relief. "Maybe," she murmured. "Or maybe they're just ugly reminders." "Ugly reminders," Harrington said, leaning closer, "are still reminders. And reminders keep us from forgetting who we've beaten." For the first time, her lips curved faintly, an expression caught somewhere between a grimace and the shadow of a smile. "You're better at this than the ship's chaplain," she muttered. "I doubt that," Harrington said, straightening again. "But I'm not here to preach. I'm here to tell you this. You've earned your place. Every scar, every sacrifice, it makes you who you are. And who you are, Lieutenant, is someone this Navy needs." The words landed heavy, but they carried weight she could not dismiss. For years, she had worn her scars like chains, proof of failure. Now, for the first time, someone had spoken of them as a banner of survival. The silence that followed was different. No longer strained, no longer haunted. It was quieter, calmer. Sarah shifted in her bed, exhaling slowly. "You didn't have to come here, sir. Admirals don't usually bother with medics bleeding in the corner." "I don't usually," Harrington admitted. "But some medics aren't Lieutenant Sarah Cole." Her eyes widened slightly at the use of her name. Formality slipped, just for a breath. She studied him, searching for insincerity, but found none. "Then I'll take that as a compliment," she said softly. "You should," Harrington replied. He straightened, preparing to leave. The infirmary had begun to stir again. Nurses moving briskly, wounded sailors groaning. Duty called him elsewhere. But he knew this conversation was not the end. "Rest, Lieutenant," he said at last. "Not because it's an order, because you've earned it." Sarah met his gaze one final time, and something passed between them, an understanding, fragile but real. For the first time, she did not feel entirely alone in the weight she carried. "Thank you, Admiral," she whispered. Harrington gave a single nod, then turned and strode away, his steps steadier now. The silence between them had been broken, and though words were few, there were enough doubt behind him. Sarah lay back against her pillows, staring at the ceiling with new thoughts stirring in her mind. The scars were still there. They would always be there. But perhaps, just perhaps, they were no longer hers to bear alone. The days that followed blurred into a rhythm of pain and persistence. The infirmary was alive with movement. Nurses checking vitals, sailors shuffling in with fresh wounds, medics murmuring orders over the hum of machines. For Sarah, every hour was a negotiation with her own body. Her ribs ached with every breath, her side flaring whenever she shifted. Sleep came in fragments, restless, jagged, haunted by flashes of the past. Yet when the nurses urged her to stay still, she gritted her teeth and pushed against their orders. She hated lying helpless. Helplessness reminded her of childhood nights where she had no choice but to endure. She would not let her body drag her back there again. On the fourth morning, she swung her legs over the bed, despite the sting of stitches. A nurse hurried toward her, alarmed. "Lieutenant, you're not cleared to walk yet." Sarah gave her a thin smile. "I'm not walking. I'm standing." There's a difference. But when her feet touched the cold floor, her knees trembled, nearly buckling. She steadied herself with a hand on the bedframe, jaw clenched in silent defiance. Pain lanced through her ribs, but she welcomed it. Pain meant she was alive. Pain meant she could still fight. From the doorway, Admiral Harrington watched in silence. He had not announced himself, he rarely did, but his sharp eyes missed nothing. She noticed him after a few moments, her breath catching as she straightened. "Admiral, you're supposed to be resting," he said, echoing his words from days earlier. Her lips curved faintly. "So everyone keeps telling me. You don't listen well." "I wouldn't be here if I did," she replied, meeting his gaze without flinching. Harrington's expression barely shifted, but deep inside, he felt a flicker of recognition. She reminded him of himself when he had been younger, stubborn, reckless, determined to stand even when the world tried to keep him down. It was both admirable and dangerous. "Sit down before you tear those stitches," he ordered at last. To his mild surprise, she obeyed, though not without muttering, "Yes, sir," under her breath with a sarcastic edge. Over the following week, Harrington found himself visiting the infirmary more often than duty required. At first, he told himself it was a matter of discipline, an admiral keeping tabs on his officers. But he knew better. Something about Sarah Cole drew him back. Not pity, not curiosity. Something sharper. She carried herself like a soldier who had fought 2 wars, one on the battlefield, and one no one else could see. He knew that second war all too well. And yet, while he carried his scars deep inside, hers were carved into her skin. Every time he saw her shift beneath the thin infirmary sheets, tugging the blanket higher as if to hide what he had already seen, his chest tightened. Not because of her weakness, but because of her strength. He recognized the battle within her, the fight not to be defined by the past, the fight to shape her own story, despite what had been written on her body. It mirrored the battle he had fought. For decades, one evening, long after most of the medics had dimmed the lights and the ward had grown quiet, Sarah found herself staring at the ceiling again. Sleep evaded her, memories crowding in instead. Her father's belt, her mother's silence, the scars that never faded. She turned onto her side, wincing, and whispered to herself, "You survived. That's all that matters." A voice answered. From the shadows, "Survival is only the first step." She startled, sitting up. Harrington emerged from the far corner, his posture straight, his face unreadable. "Admiral," she said, her voice tight. "You shouldn't sneak up on people like that." "I wasn't sneaking," he replied simply. "I was thinking." She narrowed her eyes. "About what?" He studied her for a long moment before answering. "About battles. The ones no one else sees. The ones that never end." Her throat tightened. He wasn't speaking of strategy or enemy fleets or territory. He was speaking of something far deeper, something she knew intimately. "You have them too," she said softly. More statement than question. "Yes." His voice was low, almost a confession. "More than I'd like to admit." For a moment, the infirmary seemed to fade, the walls, the machines, the sterile air. It was just the two of them. 2 soldiers sitting in the half-dark, acknowledging. Wars neither had spoken of aloud. "You carry it well," she said after a pause. "No," Harrington replied. "I carry it quietly. That is not the same thing." Sarah lowered her gaze, fingers tracing the edge of the blanket. "Quiet doesn't mean gone. I've learned that." He nodded once. "And scars don't mean broken." Her lips curved faintly. "You've said that before." "Because it bears repeating," Harrington said, almost gently. In the silence that followed, Sarah felt something shift inside her. For years, she had fought to bury her past, to silence it, to deny the scars, their voice. But sitting here, listening to the Admiral admit to his own unseen battles. She realized she wasn't alone. The thought both unsettled and comforted her. "Do you ever win?" she asked suddenly, her voice barely above a whisper. "The battles inside?" Harrington leaned back, eyes narrowing in thought. "Win?" He shook his head slightly. "No, you don't win. You endure. You adapt. Some days you hold the line. Some days you lose ground. But every morning you rise. That is victory enough." She let the words sink in, her chest rising slowly, as if each breath carried something heavier than oxygen. "Every morning you rise," she repeated softly. "Yes," Harrington said. "And you've risen far more than most." The conversation lingered between them, heavy yet strangely freeing. Sarah felt her eyes burn, but she forced the tears back. She would not cry. Not here, not now. Instead, she sat straighter, shoulders squaring as though bracing for another kind of battle, the one that came from letting someone see her, really see her. "Thank you," she said at last. Harrington inclined his head. "No thanks necessary. Just keep standing." She smiled faintly, and for the first time in weeks, it didn't feel like a mask. Over the next days, Sarah's recovery improved. She walked more, stood longer, and pushed herself past the limits the medics set. Harrington visited less openly, but always found time to check in, always asked for updates. Both carried their battles within, but now they were no longer fighting them alone. The scars remained, the memories remained. But in the shared silence between Admiral and Lieutenant, something new began to take root, something fragile, but strong enough to carry them into whatever war awaited next. The sea stretched endlessly, black and silver beneath a waning moon. From the deck of the Collister, the world looked deceptively calm. No sign of the battle that had nearly torn the ship apart remained, save for the faint scorch marks along the hull and the weary gait of the sailors moving about their duties. Sarah Cole stood near the railing, her hand resting lightly against her ribs. The stitches tugged, but the pain was manageable now, dulled into something she could carry. The wind carried salt and cold, stinging her cheeks, filling her lungs with the freshness of survival. She had insisted on walking the deck tonight, though the medics disapproved. She needed to see the sea again, to remind herself that the world was bigger than pain, bigger than scars. Footsteps approached behind her. Even without turning, she knew who it was. "Cold night." Admiral Harrington's voice rumbled. Sarah smirked faintly. "You always start conversations with weather reports, Admiral." "It's neutral territory," he replied, coming to stand beside her. His posture was as straight as ever, his uniform immaculate despite the long hours. Yet there was a subtle softness in his gaze, a quietness she had come to recognize in the weeks since the infirmary. They stood side by side, silent for a time, the ocean rolling beneath them. "You're healing well," Harrington said finally, glancing at her. "Physically, yes," she answered. She hesitated, then added, "The rest, still a work in progress." He gave a single nod. "That's how it always is. The body mends faster than the mind." Sarah looked at him, studying. The lines etched deep into his face, the scars of command that no doctor could stitch closed. "You speak like a man who knows." "I do," Harrington admitted. The wind caught his words, carried them out into the night. "I've carried my battles for a long time. Some I've won. Most I've endured." She turned fully now, her gaze steady. "And do you ever lay them down? Ever share the weight?" His lips curved in something that was not quite a smile. "Not often, not easily. Why?" "Because commanders are not supposed to show cracks. We lead from the front, and we bury the rest." He paused, then looked at her more directly than he ever had before. "But lately, I've begun to wonder if silence is really strength, or just another chain. Sarah's chest tightened at the words. She understood that conflict too well. For years, she had believed silence was armor. But scars, once seen, could not be hidden again. And maybe, just maybe, they weren't meant to be. The ocean surged against the hull. The ship creaked. For a while, neither spoke. Then Sarah said quietly, "Do you know what it felt like, Admiral? Lying there in that infirmary, showing you something I'd spent my whole life hiding?" Harrington didn't look away. "Yes, I know." She blinked. "How could you? Because I've lived it. Not the same scars, but the same silence." His voice was steady, but the weight behind it was heavy. "I grew up under a man who broke more than he built. My escape was the Navy. Discipline. Order. I thought if I buried the boy who suffered, I could become the man who commanded. And I did. But some nights, I still hear his voice." For a moment, the Admiral wasn't an untouchable figure of authority. He was a man, human, fallible, and Sarah realized he had given her something rare, a glimpse behind the iron mask. She swallowed hard. "And maybe you understand why I keep fighting. Not just on the battlefield. Here." She pressed a hand against her ribs. "I refuse to let the past decide who I am." His gaze softened, and he inclined his head slightly. "And in that refusal, you've already won more than most." They stood together in silence, the moonlight tracing silver across the waves. For Sarah, something shifted then, a loosening of the weight she had carried alone for so long. She wasn't healed, not fully. Maybe she never would be. But knowing someone else bore similar chains, and was willing to acknowledge them, made her burden lighter. "Admiral," she said finally, her tone almost hesitant. "Why me? Why come back to the infirmary? Why keep showing up?" Harrington looked back out at the ocean. "Because I saw myself in you, and because you needed someone who wouldn't look away." Her throat tightened, and she had to turn her face toward the sea to hide the emotion threatening to surface. "Thank you," she whispered. "No thanks needed," he replied. "Just promise me you'll keep rising." She managed a faint laugh, though her eyes shimmered. "Every morning, right?" "Every morning," Harrington confirmed, his voice firm but warm. The ship's night watch passed quietly, but within that quiet, something enduring was forged. Sarah knew their bond wasn't one of mentor and student, nor simply commander and subordinate. It was something more elemental, a recognition between two survivors, both scarred, both silent for too long, both learning that strength wasn't about burying pain, but about carrying it together. Weeks later, when Sarah was finally cleared for full duty, the crew watched as she returned to her post. Her steps were steady, her posture unbroken, her eyes sharper than ever. Many whispered about the scar they had glimpsed that night in the infirmary, rumors twisting into legend. But Sarah didn't care. Let them talk. The scars were hers, and they told the truth. She had endured, and she was still standing. From the command deck, Admiral Harrington watched her with quiet pride. He said nothing, but this time, his silence was not emptiness. It was acknowledgement. It was respect. And for the first time in years, he felt lighter too. The battles within them both were not over. They never would be. But they were no longer fought alone. Together, in shared silence and shared scars, they had found something stronger than pity, stronger than fear. They had found resilience, and resilience, Harrington thought, was the greatest victory of all.